Christy had visited the store, that much was certain. The clerk had seen her cheerful, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet after she left, no one knew where she went. There were no witnesses, no leads. It was as though Christy had vanished into thin air. It was a quiet, seemingly ordinary summer day when 15-year-old Christy Wesselman disappeared. Just a few minutes away from her home, she walked to a local store. A quick trip for a soda and a chocolate bar for herself and her mom. But something went horribly wrong. Christy never came back. It wasn't unusual for Christy to be out, especially in Glen Ellen, Illinois, one of the safest towns in the area. Christy was known for her love of the outdoors, often spending hours wandering the streets with other neighborhood kids. She was a social butterfly, well-liked, and even elected as vice president of her class. She was athletic too, playing volleyball and softball. A model student, a happy teenager, everything seemed perfect. But on the afternoon of July 21st, 1985, the unthinkable happened. Christy came home from school around 3:30 p.m. and, as usual, planned to head to the nearby store. Her mother expected her to return in a few minutes. It was that close. But as time passed, the minutes stretched into hours, and a sense of unease began to settle in. At first, Christy's mom assumed she had just run into friends and lost track of time. After all, there were no cell phones back then, no way to check in. She waited, growing more anxious as the sun dipped below the horizon. When evening came and Christy still didn't return, panic started to set in. Calls to her friends turned up empty. No one had seen Christy that day. Desperate, Christy's mother took to the streets herself, scanning every corner for a sign of her daughter. But there was nothing, no sign of Christy, no clue to her whereabouts. Hours passed. It wasn't until 1:50 a.m. that Christy's mother finally made the call that would set everything in motion. The police. The search had begun, but the deeper the investigation went, the stranger the clues became. Christy had visited the store. That much was certain. The clerk had seen her cheerful, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet after she left, no one knew where she went. There were no witnesses, no leads. It was as though Christy had vanished into thin air. In the coming days, the case grew colder, the mystery more unsettling. There were no signs, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if someone had erased her presence from the world entirely. What happened to Christy? And why did she never come back? The answers would come, but not in the way anyone expected. As the search for Christy Wesselman escalated, the clock ticked relentlessly, but still, there was no trace of the missing girl. The officers began piecing together her last known movements, retracing her steps with a meticulousness reserved for the most perplexing of cases. The first person they spoke with was the clerk at the store Christy had visited. The man, familiar with Christy, had even babysat her when she was younger. His recollection was clear. Christy arrived around 4 p.m., picked up a few chocolate bars, and left without saying where she was going. She appeared cheerful, he noted. No signs of distress, no hesitation in her step. Something felt off. There was no sense of urgency, no alarm in her actions. Yet, she was gone. The investigation quickly widened as officers interviewed witnesses who had also seen Christy at the store. But no one could provide any clue as to where she went after that. Her friends were questioned next, but each one denied having seen her that day. It was as though she had disappeared from their lives as quickly as she had left the store. The police's focus shifted. Every avenue was explored, every theory entertained. But as the hours passed, their efforts grew more desperate, their frustration mounting. By the time midnight arrived, the search had turned futile, with the weight of the case pressing down on them. A fresh group of officers took over the investigation at dawn. One of them, his mind sharp and focused, suggested revisiting the most obvious route. Christy could have taken a shortcut through a nearby field. This was a path that local kids frequently used to get to the store, a narrow trail worn into the tall grass by years of frequent foot traffic. The detective followed the trail, his instincts leading him deeper into the field. Then there was a flicker of movement amidst the sea of grass. His heart skipped as he approached, the sensation of dread settling in his gut. Pushing through the thick overgrowth, he uncovered the body, Christy's lifeless form. It was a sight that made his blood run cold. He recognized her instantly, and the horror of the discovery sent chills down his spine. He called for backup, the urgency in his voice betraying his shock. Forensic specialists scoured the scene, but there was nothing, no personal belongings, no signs of struggle, not even footprints. The case grew darker by the moment. Christie's cause of death was revealed, 8 stab wounds. But who had done this and why? The answers remained elusive, trapped in the silence of the tall grass. There were no witnesses, no clues, just the ominous, hollow mystery of a girl who had vanished, leaving only blood and unanswered questions behind. The investigation into Christy Wesselman's disappearance had taken a chilling turn. As the search stretched into days, the police began to piece together the few clues they had, each one darker than the last. The discovery of Christy's body had given them a tragic answer, but the questions still lingered, gnawing at the edges of their minds. There was something wrong with this case, something more sinister than anyone had anticipated. The forensic team had quickly identified evidence of sexual assault, and worse, they had gathered biological material from the perpetrator. But in 1985, DNA testing was still in its infancy, an unrefined tool that hadn't yet been integrated into routine criminal investigations. The evidence, precious as it was, would have to wait. The sample was carefully stored, but the delay in technology was like a cruel taunt. Justice hung in the balance, but for now, there was nothing more they could do with it. Christy's mother, in the midst of her heartbreak, shared another eerie detail with the detectives. Christy had been wearing a pearl ring the day she disappeared, a sentimental piece of jewelry her mother had given her. But when Christy's body was found, the ring was gone, vanished. It wasn't on her body. It wasn't at the crime scene. The killer, it seemed, had taken it. The small yet crucial detail tugged at the fabric of the investigation. Was it a trophy, a sign of personal satisfaction? Or was it a way to remove something deeply personal, a link to Christy that the killer wanted to destroy? The detectives began instructing all officers to monitor pawn shops, alert to any potential sale of the missing ring. The killer might make a mistake, and that ring could be the key to unmasking them. With no physical evidence to work with and no suspect in sight, the police cast their net wider, hoping for any potential witnesses who might have seen Christy or the killer near the field. They questioned several people who had used the same path at roughly the time of Christy's disappearance, but the responses were all the same: nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. The silence from the people who had been closest to the crime scene was unnerving. Christy's body had been found just yards off the trail, hidden in the tall grass. Yet, no one had seen anything. It didn't make sense. How could so many people be so close to the scene, and yet so oblivious to the horror that had unfolded? There was a family hosting a barbecue in their backyard just a short distance from where Christy's body was found. But even they couldn't recall hearing anything strange, nothing to suggest that something terrible was happening just beyond their fence. A gas station attendant, working his entire shift near the field, had also seen nothing. It was as though the entire town had been asleep, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in their midst. The case grew even more bizarre as the detectives considered the implications. How could a killer move so quietly, so unnoticed, in broad daylight? They theorized that the attacker had followed Christy from the store, leading her into the tall grass, and then struck without warning. No screams, no sounds, just death in the silence of the field. The detectives began to entertain the idea that Christy might have known her attacker, which would explain why there had been no cries for help. Glen Ellen was a small town. Everyone knew each other. Could the killer have been someone Christy trusted, someone she wouldn't have fought off? The police delved into Christy's past, questioning the men who had known her, the men who had been part of her life in some way. But every lead came up cold. They compiled a list of men with criminal records in the area, hoping for some connection. They interviewed several suspects, but none of them could be tied to the murder. It felt like a dead end. Months passed. The investigation became a haunting routine of dead ends, repeated questions, and fruitless searches. For 3 long years, the mystery of Christy's murder remained unsolved. Then, in 1988, a breakthrough arrived. DNA analysis had advanced, and investigators knew that the evidence they had stored away all those years ago was now crucial. They began collecting DNA samples from everyone who had been a potential suspect in Christie's case. Most of them cooperated willingly, but there was one exception: Dana Henry, a 34-year-old man who lived near the field where Christie's body had been discovered. Henry had been on the police's radar from the start. At first, he denied any involvement in the crime, but now his refusal to provide a DNA sample raised red flags. Why was he so determined to avoid the test? What was he hiding? The police decided to take legal action, seeking a court order to obtain Henry's DNA. When he appeared in court, he continued to assert his innocence, but his defiance had already cast a shadow over his claims. He was charged with contempt of court for refusing the test and was held in jail for several days. Only after the pressure mounted did Henry finally relent and provide his DNA sample. The results were conclusive. Henry's DNA did not match the biological evidence found at the scene. He was released, but the questions lingered. What had driven him to refuse the test? Was his stubbornness just a coincidence, or was there more to the story? The investigation had entered yet another unsettling chapter. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the truth about Christie's killer was still just out of reach. Each clue only deepened the mystery, and the chilling sense that someone close to Christie might be hiding the truth became more palpable with each passing year. After being released, Henry spoke to the press, revealing the harrowing conditions he had endured. He was held in a jail cell, stripped of his dignity, forced to submit to immense pressure. Only then did he reluctantly agree to provide a DNA sample. The toll was heavy. Legal fees amounted to $50,000, a staggering sum for someone like him. His home was mortgaged and eventually lost, while his relationships with family and friends crumbled. Anger and frustration swirled within him, prompting him to file a lawsuit against the police. But no matter how hard he fought, nothing came of it. Even after DNA cleared his name, whispers of guilt still lingered in the shadows, casting doubt in the minds of some. For years, Henry carried the scars of this nightmare, and the case grew cold. But in 1989, an unexpected twist brought Christie's case back into the public eye. A man named Willis, who had repeatedly contacted Christie's family with wild tips about the killer's identity, was finally restrained by the courts. The family had grown tired of his far-fetched theories, each one investigated by the police only to lead to another dead end. Willis had become a nuisance, a specter haunting the investigation. Yet, despite his obsessive interference, no evidence tied him to the crime. The years passed. Christie's case remained unsolved, the killer's identity still a mystery. But in 2000, the DNA sample from the murderer was entered into the FBI database, and the case stagnated further. Then, in 2015, an unexpected breakthrough emerged: a perfect DNA match. A notification sent shockwaves through the investigation. After decades of silence, the killer's identity was about to be revealed, and the long-untold story was on the brink of being uncovered. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. One subscribe from you will be a huge encouragement for us to grow the channel and create even better content in the future. A heartfelt thank you to my dear friends for quietly watching my videos. The case of Christie Wesselman's murder was already strange, but nothing could prepare the investigators for the twist that would unfold in 2015. It had been years, decades, in fact, since Christie's life was brutally stolen, and still, the identity of her killer remained a mystery. The case had been a haunting presence, lingering in the background of small-town life, never fully forgotten, but never quite solved either. But in 2015, the answer came in a way no one could have anticipated. The first breakthrough came with a 62-year-old man named Michael Jones. His DNA had been entered into the national database after he was arrested for domestic violence. His wife had reported him, leading to his arrest. According to an Illinois law passed in 2002, anyone arrested for a crime was required to provide a DNA sample. It was a law advocated by the state's attorney from Christie's own county, one driven, in part, by the very case that had haunted the community for decades. When the DNA match was confirmed, it was like a thunderclap in the investigation. The detectives quickly jumped into action, but the first thing that struck them was how bizarre it all was. Michael Jones had never once been mentioned during the investigation. His name had never surfaced in connection with Christie's murder, not as a suspect, not as a witness, and certainly not as someone with any apparent ties to the case. In fact, it seemed as if he had existed in a vacuum, completely invisible to the investigators until this moment. The deeper they dug into Michael Jones's past, the darker the story became. Jones wasn't a stranger to the law. His first run-in with the authorities came in the mid-70s, when he was arrested for assaulting a woman. For reasons that were never fully explained, Jones faced no real consequences for his actions. Just a year later, he attacked a 27-year-old woman, leaving her battered and abandoned in a hospital parking lot. This time, when the police issued a warrant for his arrest, Jones turned himself in. During his trial, he expressed deep regret, claiming to respect the law and even citing mental health issues that, he argued, should have been addressed. But an independent psychiatrist determined that he was fully aware of his actions. As a result, Jones was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. But here's where things get even more unsettling. Michael Jones was released early for good behavior. He served just 6 years of his sentence and was back on the streets by 1983, 2 years before Christie's murder. Worse still, the victim from his earlier crime was never informed of his release. She later stated that had she known, she would have fought tooth and nail to prevent it. This was no simple mistake. This was a failure in oversight that would come to haunt many. In 1994, just a year after his release, Jones's first wife left him and filed for a restraining order. Why? Because Jones had developed an unhealthy obsession with one of her young relatives. Still, despite this alarming behavior, no charges were filed. Jones was able to slip through the cracks again. But this wouldn't be the last time his violent tendencies resurfaced. In 1999, he was arrested once more, this time for assaulting a family member of his new girlfriend. It seemed as though his capacity for violence had no limits. But the police couldn't link him to Christie's murder, not yet. Anyway, they dug into his habits, discovering that Michael frequently took long solo motorcycle trips. He often visited relatives in Chicago, and Christie's town was on the outskirts of his route. Was it possible that he had passed through, unknowingly intersecting with Christie's path? If so, it would explain why he had never appeared on their radar. If he was merely passing through, tracking his presence would have been nearly impossible. When the police first contacted Christie's mother about Michael Jones, she had never heard his name before. At first, she didn't think much of it. Over the years, she had been contacted by investigators many times, so this just seemed like another routine inquiry. But everything changed when the police obtained a fresh DNA sample from Michael while he was in prison. The results were chilling. Michael Jones's DNA perfectly matched the biological evidence collected from Christie's crime scene. After all these years, the man responsible for her daughter's murder was finally caught. But there was more. The detectives spoke with Jones's ex-girlfriend, hoping to find additional clues to his character. What they uncovered was disturbing. Michael Jones had a volatile temperament. One moment, he was calm. The next, he was flying into a rage without warning. Even more chilling was the fact that he had an obsession with detective books and crime shows. He studied them with the kind of focus that suggested he wasn't just fascinated by crime, he was possibly learning how to get away with it. The detectives now suspected that Jones might not just be responsible for Christie's murder, but possibly for other unsolved crimes as well. His frequent solo trips, his criminal tendencies, and his obsession with true crime all pointed to one terrifying possibility. He had been practicing, learning how to cover his tracks, how to avoid detection. On September 18, 2015, the police officially charged Michael Jones with Christie's murder. He denied all involvement, but the case slowly ground its way through the legal system. After 3 years of waiting, the trial began in 2018. The prosecutors sought a life sentence, but in a twist that only added to the unsettling nature of the case. Jones decided to plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. In the end, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison, with the possibility of parole no earlier than 2095. Christie's family could finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that the man responsible for their daughter's death would never see freedom again. Yet Christie's mother couldn't shake her anger at the failures of the past. If Michael Jones had served his full sentence, Christie would still be alive today. Her life, and the lives of so many others, had been altered forever by a system that had failed to protect them. Meanwhile, Henry, the man who had been initially suspected of the crime, attended the trial of the real killer. Decades of accusations had ruined his life, and though justice had been served, it couldn't undo the damage. He still carried the weight of those false accusations, and in a later interview, he revealed the lasting scars. His life, like Christie's, would never be the same, and the investigation that had taken decades to resolve still left questions in its wake, questions about the system, about the failures, and about how easily someone like Michael Jones could slip through the cracks. Please share your thoughts in the comments section. I will discuss this case with you in more detail. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. This story is a stark reminder of how the justice system can fail, but also how persistence and new technologies can bring justice, even after decades. It teaches us the importance of staying vigilant, questioning the system, and pushing for accountability. The case also highlights the value of never giving up, whether you're a victim's family or someone seeking justice. Every life matters, and while the past can never be undone, we have the power to shape a fairer future. Let's remember that true justice doesn't come easily, but it's worth fighting for every single day.